So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah! The Detroit Lions have the best offensive line in the NFL. And there's going to be a lot of people that disagree with this. There's going to be a lot of people that say it's the Eagles. There's going to be some people arguing for other teams around the NFL. But the Detroit Lions have 100% the best offensive line in the NFL. And especially after week 10 versus a dominant and great performance versus a really good Los Angeles Chargers front seven, I think the case has been even more solidified to the fact that the Detroit Lions starting five and the rest of their offensive line is the best unit across the entire 32 teams of the NFL. And today, we are going to take a look at it, starting off with these statistics. Now, if you look at stats across the NFL, you might not say the Lions have the best offensive line in the league. After all, they rank 10th in the NFL in yards before contact, meaning every single time Craig Reynolds, David Montgomery, and Jahmyr Gibbs have touched a football this season, they have gained 2.7 yards beyond the line of scrimmage before having faced contact by the defense. That ranks them 10th in the NFL, allowing 2.7 yards before contact for every single run that they have ran this season. They rank fourth in sacks, allowing just 16 on the season, a majority of those coming in one game versus the Baltimore Ravens defense. And they rank 10th in the NFL in pressures allowed on the offensive line. Now, you might look at those stats and say, okay, so they're a top 10 offensive line. They're a top 5 offensive line in the NFL, but there's no real offensive line statistic that would tell you the Detroit Lions are the best unit in the entire NFL. And I would agree with you. There are a lot of stats out there that would argue that some other offensive lines have been playing better this season, but if you don't just take a look at the stats, if you take a look at context, if you take a look at how this offensive line has been formed and shaped and how they've been playing across the first 10 weeks of the NFL, it is a pretty clear and obvious observation that they are the absolute best. Taking a look at the offensive linemen that have played this season, because the Lions offensive line hasn't been 100% healthy, and they've actually had 10 different members, all 10 offensive linemen on the Detroit Lions 53-man roster, and even players down to the practice squad have played more than 45 snaps. Now, in an NFL game, there's roughly 60 to 80 snaps offensively in a game. Now, that can obviously range from if you're having a really poor offensive day to a really great offensive day, but right around 60 to 80 snaps is roughly where most offenses sit on a per game snap basis. The Lions offensive line have had 10 different players play 45 plus snaps for them this year, meaning they have had at least 10 offensive linemen play at half or 3/4 of a football game as a starter, as a significant role player, or as a depth piece that has had to step in due to injury. Those players include, of course, Penei Sewell, Frank Ragnow, Graham Glasgow, Taylor Decker, and Jonah Jackson. The starting 5 offensive line for the Detroit Lions has been phenomenal this year when they have been healthy. But as I said, they haven't always been healthy. You have guys like Halapaloe Vaitai, who has played nearly 200 snaps. You have guys like Kayode Owasia, who has played a lot of snaps. He's played about 130. You have guys like Colby Sorsdale, who's played 122. And even going down to the practice squad, guys like Matt Nelson and Dan Skipper have each played 50 snaps respectively and done a pretty good job when their number has been called. So they have 10 different offensive linemen playing a significant role in at least one, if not multiple games this season. And they've played really, really well. Taking a look at the starters, their starters have been phenomenal. They've only played 3 games as a full unit together, but in those games and really across the entire season, they have been phenomenal. Penei Sewell has allowed very few pressures this season. He is arguably playing like the best tackle in football and should probably get an all-pro nod this season. He has allowed 0 sacks while playing 100% of the offensive snaps for the Detroit Lions this season. Frank Ragnow, the starting center, has also allowed 0 sacks this season. He has missed 1 game, but other than that, in 9 games, he's allowed 0 sacks and only 2 penalties on the season. Graham Glasgow, after not starting the first game of the NFL season and rotating rotating it in the second game of the season, Graham Glasgow has been the definitive starter from there on out and has only allowed 1 sack through 9 games played and 9 games started. Taylor Decker missed a couple weeks here and there, but through 7 games played, he has only allowed 2 sacks on the season, and through 6 games played, Jonah Jackson has allowed just 1 sack on the season, meaning the Lions' starting offensive line, their starting 5 through 10 games of the NFL season, have allowed just 4 sacks on the quarterback. That is absolutely elite. And I know that there's going to be an argument saying, oh, well, some of them haven't played, so that's going to skew their stats. And that is true. However, all of them have played well over 6, 7 snaps worth of games and only allow 4 sacks as pretty much 7 starts across the entire board, at least on your offensive line. That is really, really good. And to put into perspective, in these same amount of games, the Eagles' offensive starters have allowed 7 sacks among their starters. Mailata has allowed 3. Dickerson at left guard has allowed 2. Jason Kelsey has allowed 1. Jurgens, who has officially played the most snaps at right guard for them, from what I could find, has allowed 0. And Lane Johnson has allowed 1, which is more than, of course, Penei Sewell. So the Eagles' starting offensive line, who is widely regarded as the best in the NFL due to the tush push and due to their offensive dominance over the last couple of years, is widely regarded as the number 1 offensive line in football. They've allowed nearly double the amount of sacks as the starters of the Detroit Lions, who have allowed just 4. And it's not like the Detroit Lions haven't played very much competition, because they've played some truly elite pass rushers. They've played guys like Rashawn Gary, who they held to just 1 tackle on the day and 0 sacks. They played Brian Burns, who did get a sack and actually got the better of Taylor Decker, giving 1 of his 2 sacks on the season to Brian Burns. They played Max Crosby and held him to a season low in pressures and 0 sacks on the quarterback, while going primarily against Penei Sewell, but also a little bit against Colby Sorsdale and Taylor Decker. They held Joey Bosa to 0 sacks. They held Vita Vea to 0 sacks. They held Khalil Mack to 0 sacks. These are some elite premier pass rushers in the NFL that the Detroit Lions have simply shut out. They have done really, really well this season, not allowing sacks, not allowing pressures, allowing some of the best pockets in the NFL for Jared Goff to work for. And that's why Jahmyr Gibbs has 3 straight games of 100 scrimmage yards. That's why David Montgomery has multiple games of 100 yards rushing, is actually leading and tied for first place in the NFL for the most 100-yard rushing games in the NFL this season, despite missing 3 or 4 games of time because of a multitude of different injuries. Amon-Ra St. Brown has 6 100-yard receiving days because the offensive line continues to protect Jared Goff, continues to give him time to find Amon-Ra St. Brown down the field, and continues to allow deeper routes and continues to allow this offense to work in stride and rhythm. And it's not just the starters, right? We talked about the starters. We talked about how Penei Sewell has been elite. We talked about how Frank Ragnow has been elite. We've talked about Decker and Jackson and even Graham Glasgow, a player that was brought in through free agency last year, being an absolutely elite member of this offensive line. But we haven't talked about some of the backups yet. And the backups are actually where I think the Lions make the best case for this, because the Lions backups have been pretty good in their own right. As I mentioned earlier, Halapaloe Vaitai, a player that started the first game of the season for the Detroit Lions versus the Kansas City Chiefs, a player that played most of the Seattle Seahawks game, has only allowed 1 sack on 192 offensive snaps for the Detroit Lions. Now, Big V unfortunately did get hurt and did unfortunately be put on IR for likely the remainder of the season at this point. But for the time he's been playing, about 3 to 4 games worth of snaps, he's allowed just 1 sack. And if you go back to his last fully healthy season, he didn't play in 2022, but in 2021, he did. He played every single snap for the Detroit Lions offensive line and allowed 0 sacks on over 1,000 snaps. So you have to go before this season back to 2020, before Dan Campbell even arrived as the Detroit Lions head coach, to the last time he gave up a sack before playing the Baltimore Ravens in Week 7. He was elite when he was on the field, and unfortunately his back issues have led to a lot of injuries and a lot of missed time. But when he's on the field, Halapaloe Vaitai has been a top-tier offensive guard in the NFL. Colby Sorsdale, a 5th-round pick out of William and Mary, has allowed 0 sacks on 122 snaps across the NFL. He played 100% of the snaps on Monday Night Football versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Went up against Max Crosby a couple times, went up against Tyree Wilson a couple times, allowed just 2 pressures and 0 sacks on 122 overall snaps. Now, I'm not sure exactly how many of those are pass blocking snaps, but at least but at least a good chunk of them are. And going up against Max Crosby for any amount of snaps and not giving up a sack is a pretty good deal for a fifth-round rookie from William and Mary. And then, of course, you have Kayode Awaskia, a guard who really has been a staple of the Detroit Lions depth for a couple of years. He has played 134 snaps for the Detroit Lions, significant snaps again on Monday Night Football versus the Las Vegas Raiders, where the Detroit Lions were missing not one, not two, but three of their interior offensive linemen. All three of their interior starters were out. Jonah Jackson missed, Frank Ragnow missed, and Graham Glasgow was in at center, not at his typical right guard position. So they really had three backups on the offensive line, and Jahmyr Gibbs still had 100 rushing yards. He still had almost 190 total scrimmage yards rushing through the interior, by the way. He mostly ran into the middle between the tackles, and a lot of that has to do with Awaskia and Sorsdale being really good blockers when they've been asked to play time. So, with that being said, the Detroit Lions have the best offensive line in football. And it's not just their starting five giving up 4 sacks as a unit this season. It's not just the fact that they have been an elite unit when they have been healthy, when they've all been together, but it's the fact that even when they're not healthy, even while playing 10 different offensive starters, 10 different players along the offensive line, and 10 different players starting games for the Detroit Lions offensive line to protect Jared Goff and work in the running game, they still rank top 10 in every offensive line category across the NFL. Halapaloe Vaitai has been great when he's been called upon. Colby Sorsdale has been great when he's been asked to play. Even Kayode Awaskia has been really, really good when he has been asked to play as well. Matt Nilsson gave up 2 sacks, but even then, he's been fairly serviceable when he's been asked to go in over the last couple of years. And Dan Skipper went in for a couple snaps and also did not give up a sack at the interior position. It was against Seattle where they had all of those offensive line injuries. He went in at left guard, never having played that position before, and gave up 0 sacks on 45 offensive snaps. The Lions offensive line is not just good on one side. It is not just good as a starting 5 or a starting 6 or a starting 7. The Detroit Lions could genuinely have a fully backup offensive line and still probably rank as one of the top halves in the NFL because they are truly that good, that talented, and that deep along the offensive line. And a lot of work and a lot of credit has to go out to their offensive line coach, Hank Fairley, for being one of the best offensive line coaches across the entire league and being so since Dan Campbell has arrived. He was one of the coaches Dan Campbell decided to keep around from the Patricia era, and it has paid off massively for the Detroit Lions over the last couple of years. So with all that being said, that is my case for the Detroit Lions to be the number 1 offensive line in all of football. I think they are the best. I think they are deep enough, they are talented enough, they are successful enough, they play well enough together to make the case, and a very strong case at that, to be the best offensive line in football. So with all that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below how you feel about this offensive line. If you are an Eagles fan, if you are a fan of another team and think your offensive line challenges the Detroit Lions, put down in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. But with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you both so very much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.